The storm of New Avalon. The neon lights of New Avalon shimmered through the relentless acid rain, casting an eerie glow on the puddles that formed in the cracked streets below. The city never truly slept, not in the way most cities did. Here, the constant hum of machinery, the hiss of steam pipes, and the crackling of the acid rain against the metal buildings created a rhythm, a symphony of life that never ceased. It was a world built on steel and survival, and its citizens were forged from the same unyielding material. Shawn Blackwood stood outside the gear bar, his boots crunching against the slick, metal-clad sidewalk. He could feel the buzz of the local spirit still simmering in his bloodstream, but it was the sting of the rain on his exposed face that snapped him back to reality. The downpour wasn't like any rain he'd ever encountered. No, it wasn't rain at all. It was acid. It ate away at everything, corroding metal, skin, and the very air itself if you weren't careful. His armor was built for this, a masterpiece of Earth's finest technology. The dark, combat-hardened exoskeleton clung to his form, a perfect fit for someone with a physique like his. Broad-shouldered, muscular from years of surviving in high-gravity environments, and standing a solid 6'2", Shawn was an imposing figure. He wasn't just a soldier, he was a survivor. His armored body was a fortress. But even with all that technology, the acidic rain wasn't something to take lightly. As the acidic droplets splashed against his shielded dome, they evaporated almost instantly, turning into a toxic mist. It wasn't a pleasant experience, but it was manageable. He pulled his collar up, his gloved fingers brushing against the cold metal, and turned away from the bar. His thoughts were already drifting back to the quiet of his apartment, but as he began to walk, his attention was drawn to something in the corner of his vision, a flicker of movement in the shadows. A figure. A woman. Shawn's eyes narrowed, scanning the darkened streets. She was pressed against the wall of a nearby building, doing her best to avoid the deadly rain. Her soaked black hair clung to her face, and her clothes, clearly of high quality, expensive, and tailored, suggested she wasn't some lowly street dweller. She was out of place in this part of New Avalon, and Shawn's instincts immediately told him that something was off. Without thinking, he altered the trajectory of his path, crossing the slick pavement toward her. His boots made a soft squelching sound in the puddles, and with every step, he noticed how her eyes flashed in the dim glow of the neon lights. They were an arresting blue, the color of the sky before the storm. But in the acid rain, they reflected the lights like mirrors, striking, almost unnatural. Shawn found himself inexplicably drawn to her, even though his gut told him to be cautious. He cleared his throat, raising his voice above the sound of the rain. "You're out of your mind, walking in this mess without protection. You know that, right?" The woman didn't immediately respond, instead lifting her chin defiantly, as if his words were beneath her. Shawn could see the faintest irritation flicker in her eyes. She didn't seem scared, didn't seem to care about the dangers of the environment surrounding them. She simply seemed resolute. "I was born here," she finally replied, her voice steady, yet carrying an accent that was unfamiliar to him. She sounded like someone who had been educated, someone who had a sense of entitlement. Not the kind of person you'd typically find in the slums of New Avalon. "Born here, sure," Shawn muttered, raising an eyebrow. "Smart enough to survive here." "That's debatable." She raised a brow in return. "I'll survive just fine." The brief exchange only made Shawn more curious. He couldn't help himself. He took another step closer, the energy field from his shield flickering in the air between them. The mist from the rain hissed and evaporated the moment it came in contact with the shield, but it wasn't enough to shield her from the reality of the storm. He wasn't sure if she was too proud to ask for help or just completely oblivious to the danger she was in. "I'm Shawn," he said, his voice softening. "And you are?" The woman hesitated for just a moment, as if deciding whether or not to share her name. Finally, she spoke, and her words were clear, each syllable carefully chosen. "Viria. Viria Valyrian. The name hit him like a hammer. Valyrian. The Valyrians were one of the most powerful families in New Avalon. Her last name wasn't just a title. It was a legacy. Viria Valyrian was the daughter of Baron Valyrian, a powerful figure with influence stretching across the entire western sector of the city. The realization slammed into Shawn, but he didn't let it show. He simply nodded. Viria Valyrian, he repeated under his breath, tasting the name on his tongue. He felt something shift in the air between them, a subtle change, as if the gravity of the situation had just increased tenfold. "Look," he said, a new tone in his voice. "The acid rain out here will melt through you in minutes if you don't get under cover. So unless you've developed some sort of immunity to this, I'm offering you shelter. It's the least I can do." Viria took a long moment to evaluate him, her eyes scanning his face, his armor, his shield. He was offering her something more than just protection from the storm. She seemed to know it, but instead of pushing him away, she let her posture soften slightly. "That would be acceptable," she said, and the words surprised Shawn. There was no hint of rebellion, no more defiance in her voice. It was the first time she had actually sounded like someone who was in need of help. They began to walk together through the rain-soaked streets of New Avalon. The city itself seemed alive with noise, with energy, almost as if the constant drizzle of acid was just part of the background music. The rhythmic pounding of the rain echoed around them, but the shield surrounding them gave a strange sense of calm. It kept them safe. The world around them felt distant, like they were in a bubble where only the two of them existed. Shawn couldn't shake the feeling that this was no coincidence. There was something in the way she moved, an effortless grace despite the dangerous streets of New Avalon. Every step she took was calculated, measured, like someone used to navigating the chaos of a city that never stopped fighting. She was from a different world, he could tell that now. And yet, here they were, together, caught in the storm, sharing space under his shield. As they continued down the dark alleyways, past the flickering lights, Shawn's mind kept returning to the woman beside him. Viria Valyrian. It wasn't just her name that intrigued him. It was the way she carried herself, the way her eyes lingered just a bit longer on the world around them. She was calculating, observant, and she wasn't just another rich kid who happened to be caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. There was something more beneath the surface. He didn't know it yet, but the storm around them wasn't the only thing that would change the course of their lives forever. The uneasy alliance, the distant hum of industrial machines blended with the rhythm of the rain, as Shawn guided Viria through the winding alleyways of New Avalon. The narrow streets were lined with rusted, decaying buildings, once proud structures now reduced to skeletal remnants of a forgotten era. Neon signs flickered overhead, advertising everything from the latest synth drink to illegal cyberware. The city was alive, but only in the most desperate of ways, like a beast struggling to survive amidst a crumbling empire. Shawn's gaze remained fixed ahead, scanning for any potential threats. As much as he wanted to focus on the woman walking beside him, he couldn't ignore the constant danger that lurked in the shadows. New Avalon was a place where you couldn't afford to be distracted, not for even a second. Still, something about Viria had drawn him in. Her presence felt like a riddle, one that demanded solving. She wasn't just another spoiled noble lost in the depths of the city. No, there was a sharpness to her that made Shawn's instincts pulse with unease. Viria, on the other hand, seemed to move with the confidence of someone who had been here before. Her footsteps were light but deliberate, her eyes constantly shifting, reading the environment around them. It was clear she wasn't accustomed to vulnerability, not even in a city as unforgiving as this one. Finally, they reached the entrance to a small, run-down apartment complex, a place where only the most resilient or desperate chose to live. The door groaned as Shawn pushed it open, the smell of damp concrete and stale air immediately assaulting their senses. Inside, the hallway was dimly lit, the floor covered in puddles of stagnant water, and the walls were adorned with peeling posters that had long since lost their meaning. "This is where I live," Shawn said, his voice flat. "Not much to look at, But it's safe. For now. Viria didn't respond immediately. She took in her surroundings with a careful, calculating gaze, as if she was trying to piece together the story of this place in an instant. Shawn watched her, noting the slight furrow in her brow. Despite the damp and the decay, she didn't look disgusted. Instead, it seemed like she was measuring it, assessing how much the conditions here might challenge her. It made him wonder if she'd ever truly been in a place like this, away from the comforts of her family's wealth and power. They ascended a narrow staircase, the old metal creaking beneath their feet with every step. At the top, Shawn fumbled with a rusty key and unlocked a door that seemed to have seen better days. The room beyond was small, barely enough space for the single bed, a broken-down couch, and a few scattered supplies. The walls were bare except for a single window, which looked out over the sprawling mess of New Avalon. Through the haze of rain, one could just make out the distant outline of the city's central spire, a towering monument of glass and steel that loomed over the entire metropolis like a reminder of what the city had once been. But that was before the rebellion, before the corporatocracy took over, and before the Valyrians had risen to power. Shawn's fingers traced the edge of the metal table in the center of the room, his mind already drifting away from the present. He tossed his wet jacket onto a chair and motioned for Viria to take a seat. "Make yourself comfortable," he muttered, though he knew it wasn't really possible in a place like this. Viria, however, stood in the doorway for a moment longer, her sharp eyes taking in every detail. Finally, she crossed the threshold and stepped inside, closing the door behind her with an almost imperceptible click. She didn't sit right away. Instead, she turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "I'm not sure what you think you're doing, Blackwood," she said, her voice soft, but laced with something that wasn't quite challenge, but wasn't exactly gratitude either. "I didn't ask for your help." Shawn leaned against the table, folding his arms. He was used to this. People acting like their lives didn't owe a thing to anyone. Viria Valyrian might have been born with a silver spoon in her mouth, but that didn't mean she couldn't be just as prideful as any hardened street rat. Still, he didn't react with the same coldness that he might have with someone else. "I didn't ask for your company either, but here we are," he replied. "I figured you prefer a roof over your head instead of standing out there getting melted by acid rain." Viria's lips twitched at the corner, just the smallest flicker of something close to amusement. It was fleeting, like a brief flash of light in a darkened room. "You don't understand, do you?" she said, her gaze hardening. "I don't need you to save me. I never did." Shawn met her gaze with a steady stare. "You don't need saving, sure, but you need shelter. And I don't think anyone in this place would offer you the same. You'd be dead in an hour at best." For a moment, there was only silence. The hum of the machinery outside, the distant roar of hovercars flying overhead, and the sound of rain tapping against the window seemed to drown out everything else. Viria's eyes softened, but only slightly. She wasn't done with him yet. Not by a long shot. "Maybe I don't need saving," she said quietly. "But you're a soldier, aren't you? A man used to fighting, used to killing." Shawn's muscles tensed, his eyes narrowing slightly. He was no stranger to those kinds of accusations. He didn't hide the truth of who he was, not to anyone who was willing to listen, but he didn't like people to speak about it, as if it were some sort of fact they could use against him. "Maybe I am," he said, his voice low, dangerous. "But that doesn't mean I'll stand by and watch someone die, just because they're too proud to admit they need help." Viria seemed to study him for a long moment, her lips parting as though she were about to respond. But then she paused. Instead of firing back, she seemed to consider his words, her expression shifting from defiance to something closer to contemplation. "You've lived in the depths of New Avalon long enough to know that trust is a rare commodity here," she said at last, her voice quieter now. "You don't trust anyone, and you sure as hell don't trust people who've lived above the filth, especially not someone like me." Shawn chuckled softly, the sound bitter. You think I care about your last name? I couldn't give a damn about the Valyrian dynasty. People like you, people with power, think they can control everything. But here, in the gutters, power doesn't mean shit. Viria's eyes flashed, something sharp sparking behind them. She took a step toward him, her voice low but intense. You don't know who I am, Blackwood, she said. Not really. But you will, whether you like it or not. The air between them crackled with tension. Shawn had never been one to back down from a fight, but something about Viria's words unsettled him. Maybe it was the weight they carried, the ominous sense that this wasn't just a chance meeting. The rain continued to pound against the window, the world outside still as chaotic as ever. Inside, the space between them felt charged, as if they were both standing on the edge of something dangerous. A new chapter was about to begin, and Shawn had a feeling that nothing would ever be the same again. Shadows of the past. The city of New Avalon never truly rested. Its lights never dimmed, its engines never cooled, and its acid rain, falling in torrents from the perpetually stormy skies, never stopped. But inside the dimly lit room Shawn had called his temporary refuge, the air felt still. The rhythmic hum of the energy shield outside barely registered now. In this small, makeshift apartment, time seemed to slow, as if the world had momentarily ceased moving to allow him and Viria a moment of silence. Shawn placed the glass of whiskey down on the table, his gaze never leaving Viria. Her eyes, still sharp and watchful, tracked his every move. He knew that look. She was weighing him, considering his every action, processing, analyzing. She was no stranger to danger, nor to the weight of decisions. Shawn, despite his years of experience navigating the gritty corners of the galaxy, felt as though he were stepping onto uncertain ground. You don't belong here, you know. Shawn spoke first, his voice cutting through the silence. It was an observation, not a question. Viria had come from a world far removed from the gritty underbelly of New Avalon, a world of privilege and power, the daughter of the influential Baron Valyrian. She had no business being out here in the slums, let alone in his apartment in the midst of the storm. But here she was. Viria's eyes narrowed, but her expression softened slightly. She shifted in her seat, leaning back in her chair as if considering how much of the truth she wanted to share. The room felt small, and Shawn couldn't help but feel the weight of the moment pressing in on them. I never said I belonged here, Viria replied, her voice steady, but not without a trace of defiance. But sometimes, it's the only place where I can breathe. Shawn took a long sip from his glass, staring into the amber liquid, as if the whiskey could offer him the answers he was looking for. He didn't believe her at first, but something about her presence, her words, struck a chord deep inside. It wasn't just her beauty, or the way she seemed out of place in this world. It was the way she spoke, as though she had known both privilege and pain, both luxury and loss. He had no idea what it meant to be the daughter of someone like Baron Valyrian, but the hints of weariness in her voice suggested that it wasn't as glamorous as it appeared. You're not like the others, Shawn muttered, almost to himself. You don't act like them. You don't think like them. Viria's lips curved into a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Maybe I'm not like them because I've never had the luxury of being like them. Her words were cold, each syllable a carefully chosen blade that cut through the air. You wouldn't understand. Shawn raised an eyebrow. Try me. There was a long pause, the silence thick and heavy between them. Outside, the acid rain continued to hammer against the walls of the building, the hiss of it creating a backdrop to the charged atmosphere inside. Viria stood up, moving with a grace that was almost otherworldly, her wet hair still clinging to her neck and shoulders. She walked slowly toward the window, peering out at the storm that consumed the city. I was born into a family of power, Viria began, her voice quieter now, almost lost beneath the sound of the downpour. But power doesn't come without cost. She turned back to him, her blue eyes piercing through him. I've spent my entire life being molded into something my father wants. something the Valyrian name demands. But no one ever asked me what I wanted." Shawn remained silent, his thoughts racing. This was the first glimpse he had into the woman before him, the woman who had so effortlessly cut through the chaos of the street fight, the woman who had walked beside him without hesitation even when danger loomed just around the corner. But now, the mask was cracking. He could see it, glimpses of the person she had tried so hard to hide. She wasn't just some noblewoman, confined by the expectations of her name. She wasn't simply the daughter of a man who could shape cities with a word. She was a person who had been burdened by her family's legacy, by the power that had been thrust upon her before she was even old enough to understand it. And now, it seemed, she was searching for something more. "Your father," Shawn said after a long pause, his voice soft but tinged with the curiosity he could no longer ignore. "Isn't he the one who decides what's best for you? The one who wants to control everything in your life?" Viria's eyes flashed with something dark and dangerous, but her voice remained even. "He believes in control. Control of everything. The land, the people, the alliances, and most of all, control over me, my future, my choices. Sounds like you're just another pawn in his game," Shawn said, a touch of bitterness in his voice. "Exactly," Viria whispered, her gaze locked on his. "But I'm done being a pawn." The words hung in the air, and for the first time that night, Shawn understood her. He understood the weight of her burden, the pressure that came with being born into a family like the Valyrians. Power wasn't a gift, it was a prison. And from the way she spoke, it was a prison she was fighting to escape. Shawn didn't know how, but he knew that this woman, Viria Valyrian, was more than just a highborn noble. She was something far more complicated. The room felt small again, the walls closing in on them, and yet there was something undeniably magnetic about her. The way she held herself, the fire in her eyes, the quiet strength in her voice, it all drew him in. The tension between them was palpable, thick enough to cut through. But it wasn't just physical attraction. It was something deeper, something neither of them could fully explain. They were two different worlds, two different people, yet they were linked now, tethered by the events of the night. By the acid rain, by the fight in the alley, and by the shared moment of understanding between them. Shawn set his glass down, his fingers grazing the rim, and took a step closer to Viria. He didn't know what would happen next. He didn't know what this woman was truly capable of. But he knew one thing. He wasn't about to walk away from this. Not yet. Not when there was so much more left unsaid. Viria turned away from the window, her face unreadable. "I didn't ask for this life, Shawn," she murmured, her voice breaking for just a moment. "But it's the life I've been given. And I'll make sure that it doesn't control me any longer." Shawn didn't speak right away. He knew that there was more to her story, but he also knew that some things couldn't be rushed. The truth would come out in its own time. But whatever path she chose, whatever path he chose, he could already feel the weight of that choice in the air between them. The storm outside raged on. But inside, in the quiet of Shawn's apartment, time seemed to stretch infinitely. And for the first time in a long time, Shawn Blackwood couldn't predict what would come next.